Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Yes, you can. Hello. Let us get started. Dear Mayor Soehlke, dear Bernd Engler, President, how nice to see you again in this function, in a way from president to president. Dear organizing team, dear colleagues, and dear Professor Andreotti, I don't know whether she is already part of this and can already hear us. I'm very happy and very proud to welcome all of you to the 68th annual meeting of the German Association of American Studies in Tübingen. This is the first meeting hosted by the new executive board, and I extend a warm welcome also in the name of my two colleagues in arms, Simon Wendt and Miriam, where is she? and Miriam Strube. This is, of course, also the first meeting that we're having in person again, after 2 years of abstaining from personal meetings due to the pandemic. We're very excited about this chance of direct interaction and actual context. I do remember at this moment very vividly one of the first meetings that I ever attended in American Studies, and that was the annual meeting in Münster in 1991, because I was then still a student. It was, I think, the second meeting that I ever attended, and I was working at the time for Heinz Ickstadt at the Kennedy Institute in Berlin as a student assistant, and this was the first year of his tenure as president of the association. In Münster, he gave his first welcome to the association as a president, and I remember that I was awed by his witty remarks, by his presence, but also that I was struck by how nervous he was at the time, and I thought, thank God I never have to do that. And this has come back to haunt me. Something must have gone wrong on the way. At any rate, here I am now, and it is as it is. I say a few words about the conference theme and the conference program before I give over to my fellow speakers. I think there is probably no more timely topic than political education for a meeting this year, because obviously education is key on so many fronts, and the conference program reflects this timeliness in all of its width, allowing us to engage with the topic in its manifold implications through keynotes and workshops. I'm particularly happy that the conference organizing team consists of a scholar of foreign language education and teacher training, next to 2 scholars of literature and culture, and that it underscores already in this kind of teaming that education is always a matter, as much a matter of practice as it is of theory. We need to approach education concretely, and we need to do so by taking educational systems into account. This means reflecting on our own profession and business, the university, and many of the talks in the different workshops will do so, but it also means to take the educational system at large into account and to deal with the complicated and fraught world of the school systems in the United States and in Germany, and elsewhere, probably. There is another great chance to the topic of political education, and this consists in its intersectional dimension, as it were. It allows us to see an entanglement that all too often is invisibilized. After all, discussions about acute problems, critical conditions, and emergency measures are infected by exclusive attention mongering all too often. In consequence, the importance of a particular topic, and that could be the pandemic, it could be the war in Ukraine, it could be the climate crisis, it could be the economic disparity at hand. The importance of each one of these topics tends to be used to contest the importance of all others. Because we have been distracted by the climate issue, this logic runs, we did not face the emerging threat of Russia in Ukraine. Because we are too involved with foreign politics, we're paying too little attention to inflation and poverty. Because we're too concerned with economic issues, we're losing sight of the pandemic, etc., etc. But of course, all of these things and many more are complicatedly related. The heated debates about the educational systems in the United States and in Germany bring this to the fore, waging around questions of access and power, parity and diversity, purposes and content. They touch upon every one of the pressing concerns of our day, forcing us to face very fundamental questions of ethics and responsibility. And questions that have to do with the future and with the past. Do the paradigms of modernity, progress, growth, optimization still work? Did they ever work? Should and can they be applied to the systems at large? Should they be applied to educational systems? Do they comply with the needs of cultures, communities, and schools? Is the goal more of the same or something different altogether? It seems to me that this is a discussion that we have been having in the association for a while, and that we will continue to have this debate because it is the political and educational issue of our days, at the core of all the others. So let's do this. Let's talk and tell each other about our insights, our ideas and our findings, and let's try to come to terms with all of this together. Not necessarily always in agreement, but with the mutual respect and consideration that has, fortunately, always prevailed in the association and its interactions. As always, the president of the association gets to extend the welcome and invite to the event, but the work of setting it up is done by others. Let me end by expressing our gratitude to the local organizers from the sections of American Studies and Foreign Language Teaching at the English Seminar of Eberhard Karls, Universität, Astrid Franke, Uwe Küchler, and Katharina Luther, At least they're kind of nicely set up, who have taken over the responsibility of this daunting job, and they have been doubtlessly helped by many more who we will get to know in the next days. And thanks, of course, to all of you who are going to present and otherwise actively engage in the conference. I'm wishing all of us a productive, stimulating, and joyful conference.
Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome from the city of Tübingen. I have to start with 3 apologies. First of all, I'm not Bernd Engler. He's standing over there. As you can see in your program, we shifted a little bit because I'm a little bit out of time, and I have to go to my next meeting in the next minutes. My name is Soehlke. I'm the so-called Erste Bürgermeister, first mayor of the city, not the Lord Mayor, but the deputy mayor, more or less responsible for all the urban planning. Second apology, we would have liked to invite you in our city hall, but as you can see by your number, it would have not been possible. We should have the possibility during the next days to go there, to go to the historical inner city. And to see our City Hall, it would be a great pleasure to see you there if you're in small groups and not in such a big group like today. That would have not worked. And third apology, as you can easily see, my English must be the poorest in this place. And as I learned, 95% of you can speak German. I will shift now to German for the next 3 minutes of my speech to talk a little bit about our city. Also nochmal herzlich willkommen von mir. Ich glaube, Sie haben sich mit Ihrem Thema und der Stadt was ganz Gutes ausgesucht als Kombination. Ich weiß nicht, wie viele von Ihnen Tübingen gut kennen oder sehr gut kennen. Ich bin jetzt auch ein bisschen für den kleinen Werbeblock für die Stadt hier zuständig an der Stelle und möchte so ein bisschen auch Ihnen was über das Wesen und den Charakter der Stadt, in der Sie jetzt zu Gast sind, in den nächsten Tagen vermitteln. Ich glaube, viel davon werden Sie aber auch mitkriegen, wenn Sie durch die Stadt gehen. Das ist, glaube ich, so eins der ersten Anzeichen und Kennzeichen von Tübingen, die ich immer ganz toll finde, dass die Stadt eigentlich sehr erlebbar und sehr öffentlich ist und sehr öffentlich stattfindet. Und ich glaube, dass gerade dieses Thema politische Erziehung, politische Bildung eine große Rolle spielt. Zum einen sind wir ja sozusagen von unserem Gründungsmythos her eine Bildungsstadt. Manche sagen, Tübingen hat keine Universität, sondern Tübingen ist eine Universität. Der Rektor sagt das besonders gerne an der Stelle, weil er damit auch auf das eigentliche Stadtoberhaupt verweist hier in der Stadt. Aber es ist tatsächlich so, dass natürlich die Universität und die Stadt auch schon in ihrer ganzen Entwicklungsgeschichte und auch in ihrem alltäglichen Leben sehr, sehr eng miteinander verzahnt sind. Das heißt, das Thema Bildung spielt eine große Rolle. Aber Tübingen ist eben auch eine sehr politische Stadt und eine Stadt der politischen Diskussion und der politischen Auseinandersetzung. Ich bin Kommunalpolitiker und als solcher bin ich sowieso davon überzeugt, dass die wesentlichen politischen Auseinandersetzungsprozesse eigentlich im kommunalen Bereich, also da, wo man sie mit der Hand greifen kann und wo man sie tatsächlich wahrnimmt, stattfinden können und dass das nicht nur eine Ebene dann auf der europäischen Ebene oder auf der Bundesebene ist, sondern dass man gerade im kommunalen Raum sehr viel an politischen Diskussionen ermöglichen kann, dass er da gerade notwendig ist, da es da auch so etwas wie Gesellschaftsbildung stattfindet. Und das ist etwas, was man in dieser Stadt eigentlich mit Händen greifen kann, an jeder Stelle. Man muss eigentlich nur, wir werden es die nächsten Tage wahrscheinlich auch mal machen, das Tagblatt aufschlagen morgens und sich die Leserbriefseiten unseres Tagblatts angucken, die sind legendär. Also in besonderen Zeiten, wenn wir Stadtbahnen bauen oder wenn wir Oberbürgermeister neu wählen oder Ähnliches, dann hat man da auch mal 3 oder 4 Seiten von Leserbriefen. Es gibt sogar tatsächlich so etwas wie ein Kontingent. Man darf, ich glaube, im Jahr nur noch 10 Leserbriefe schreiben, danach fliegt man raus. Und man darf sich auch nur in einem begrenzten Maße Ping-Pong liefern. Also auch da sagt die Redaktion inzwischen, wenn sich Leute 3 oder 4 Mal gegenseitig geschrieben haben, anstelle mal zum Telefonhörer zu greifen, sondern übers Tagblatt sich so eine Brieffreundschaft entwickelt hat, dann ist man raus. Aber es findet eben auch in dem politischen Alltag jenseits der Zeitung statt. Wir haben ein sehr lebendiges Kommunalparlament, in dem sehr viel diskutiert wird, nicht immer zur Freude der Universität, aber meistens mit einem positiven Ergebnis für die Universität, wenn ich in die letzte Zeit zurückgucke. An der Stelle aber auch sehr intensiv diskutiert hat. Wir haben einen Oberbürgermeister, der den meisten von Ihnen bekannt ist und den ich heute hier auch vertreten darf, der auch dafür bekannt ist, dass er gerne streitet und gerne diskutiert. Und Sie werden das an ganz vielen Stellen erleben in der Stadt, wenn Sie so in das städtische Leben hineingucken, dass politische Streit, politische Diskussion in einem positiven Sinne ein ganz großer Teil von Tübingen sind. 2 andere Bemerkungen noch zu Tübingen, wenn Sie durchgehen und wenn Sie die Stadt wahrnehmen, die jetzt auch ein bisschen nochmal aus meiner Disziplin ist. Tübingen ist eine Stadt der Innovationen und eine Stadt, in der man gerne erfindet und in der man gerne auch versucht, Neues zu probieren. Das hat ganz viel mit dem zu tun, was wir in der Stadtplanung und der Stadtentwicklung probieren. Da ist Tübingen sicherlich bundesweit immer einer der Vorreiter, hat aber auch mit anderen Themen zu tun. Ich will eine Erfahrung vielleicht kurz mit Ihnen teilen, die wir vor einem Jahr gehabt haben, als die Corona-Pandemie sozusagen, ich glaube, ihre 3. Welle durchlaufen hatte, waren wir, wenn ich mich richtig erinnere, der einzige Ort im Umkreis von ungefähr 500 Kilometern, wo man einen Cappuccino auf der Straße trinken konnte, weil wir gesagt haben, wir wollen jetzt eben versuchen, nicht wie das Kaninchen vor der Corona-Schlange zu sitzen, sondern ein Konzept gemacht haben, das damals Öffnen mit Sicherheit hieß und wo wir gesagt haben, wir müssen irgendwie auch kommunalpolitisch was probieren und was ausprobieren und anzufangen. Das ist etwas, was sich sehr durch den Geist dieser Stadt zieht, also das Innovative und auch der Versuch, tatsächlich neue Wege zu gehen und auch was auszuprobieren, was auch ein bisschen riskant ist. Auch das gehört, glaube ich, finde ich, sehr viel in dieses Thema der politischen Bildung dazu. Und Tübingen ist eine sehr grüne Stadt. Auch das werden Sie hoffentlich während der nächsten Zeit und der nächsten Tage wahrnehmen, nicht nur im tatsächlichen Sinne mit viel Bäumen und viel Grün an der Stelle und viel wahrnehmbarem Landschaftsraum. Nutzen Sie die Stadt, aber nutzen Sie auch die Landschaftsräume, wenn Sie hier sind, sondern es ist auch eine politisch grüne Stadt. Sowohl das Kommunalparlament hat eine grüne Mehrheit, als auch der Oberbürgermeister ist grün. Und auch das ist tatsächlich etwas, was, ohne dass ich da Parteiwerbung machen will, und ich bin auch selber parteilos, was tatsächlich zu der Diskussionskultur in dieser Stadt sehr stark dazugehört und dazu beiträgt an der Stelle. Ich wünsche Ihnen gute Tage in dieser Stadt. Ich hoffe, dass Sie die Möglichkeit haben, aus den Hörsaalräumen rauszukommen und in die Stadt zu gehen und in die Realität der Stadt zu gehen und hoffe, dass wir Ihnen ein guter Gastgeber sind. Und damit verabschiede ich mich, dann bin ich nämlich rechtzeitig im Rathaus. Herr Engler.
Thank you very much, First Mayor Soehlke. I think our mayor has properly, marvelously described the character of Tübingen. Tübingen is a university town, and you know, usually I would have said it's not a town, it's a university which kind of affords a town as an environment which will help us to survive as students and so on and so forth. Anyway, we consider Tübingen a university with a town, and nevertheless we have debates with the town, which is okay, town and gown, gown and town, and as you can also see, a rector of a university, a president of a university can survive in such a town. It needs some stamina occasionally, but all that is absolutely fine. I also have to confess that I asked our Lord Mayor, not Lord Mayor, our first mayor, to tell you that he is not Bernd Engler, because some of you might have thought, oh, he has changed dramatically over the years. So this is me and not the first mayor of the town of Tübingen. But let me begin with my official speech. Dear Professor Meyer, dear members of the German Association of American Studies, dear colleagues, and especially dear colleagues, my Tübingen fellow colleagues, and then also distinguished guests. I'm pleased to welcome you to the 68th annual meeting of the German Association of American Studies. After 2 years of disruptions, as we have already heard, it is extremely gratifying to be able to come together again in person. And for our university, it's particularly delightful that you can now convene in Tübingen. It is the third time since the establishment of the German Association of American Studies that our university is privileged to host this illustrious conference. As president of the University of Tübingen, but also as a professor of American Studies, I'm in fact very, very grateful that Tübingen was chosen for this conference. I still like to say professor of American Studies, although there is some slight distance between this job and my current job, which I had, some people would say occupied for 16 years. Astrid Franke, you shouldn't not, you know. You should shake your head for such statements. Anyway, some people would say that I occupied the position, but for 16 years. But it's a fun position anyway. So why not enjoy a position which is quite nice to be in? As you probably know, the University of Tübingen is one of Europe's oldest universities with a history of 500 or almost 550 years. For centuries, it has been a place where intellectual history was written. Hegel, Hölderlin, or Schelling, and in addition, many renowned researchers in natural sciences who have achieved groundbreaking innovations. Occasionally, if colleagues from China, India, wherever, come to Tübingen, they tend to ask now, where is the Hegel statue? And we don't have a statue, but obviously Tübingen seems to be quite renowned for having trained Hegel as one of the great philosophers and philosopher who is recognized worldwide. So Tübingen, yeah, what else do we have to say? Today, Tübingen ranks among the top 100 universities worldwide. And by the way, and this is important, the university's international visibility rests to a great extent on its humanities. This seems to be something that seems to be almost impossible, but in fact it is. Literary and cultural studies, history, linguistics, education, media studies, etc., are the very basis of our international standing. And in this year's Times Higher Education ranking, the humanities are placed 20th in the international ranks, which is quite an accomplishment, I would say. And by the way, this also tells a story that a university of excellence does not slaughter the humanities. We give them enough support, more than enough support. She doesn't look. More than enough support, but rightfully enough support to thrive and move ahead. Just to remind you, American studies have been an integral part of the humanities since 1958. 58 was a year when the first professorship in American studies and cultural history was established. Now, today, research conducted by the American Studies program addresses all aspects of American culture, literature, society, and politics. Scholars are currently involved in several high-profile research projects. An ERC-funded Consolidator grant, for example, investigates the significance of conspiracy theories for populist movements. A DFG-funded collaborative research center deals with threatened orders, in particular visions of alternative racial orders in the US. As such, our American Studies program has become an integral part of most of the humanities projects, and I think this is something that is also quite stunning, that a relatively small field can take part in many, many projects. And I think our American Studies program is also part of our endeavor to strengthen the collaborative research environment in Tübingen. I might point to the School of Education, one of today's organizers, a school that coordinates activities related to teacher education. I might also refer to our Interdisciplinary Center for Global South Studies, which provides a networking platform for researchers, scholars from all over the world. And American Studies also plays a part in that. Or I might point at the research platform Global Encounters, a platform that brings together researchers from social sciences and humanities in order to examine the social and cultural effects of mobility, of communication, and all forms of interaction on national levels, on global levels, etc., etc. Our American Studies are indeed an active part of all these endeavors. One brief comment on the topic of the conference, as Professor Meyer already pointed out, it certainly is well chosen. In view of increasing political disruptions, strife, and conflict in America, you might recall that we still have some antagonism in America, and it might even be growing, but also in all other quarters of the earth. Given all these conflicts, I think the topic proves to be central and timely to be addressed today. But let me come to the end of my speech. I'm particularly pleased to be able to welcome so many participants from abroad. My warmest welcome to all of you. A special greeting goes to the 3 plenary speakers from Vancouver, from Boston, and from Mainz. Thank you very much for joining us and contributing to this vibrant exchange of ideas. Cultivating an international exchange is one of the key pillars of all of our endeavors, your endeavors, to face the enormous political and social challenges of our time. So, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a good time in Tübingen. May you enjoy promising 3 days with inspiring plenary talks, engaging workshops, sessions, and stimulating discussions. And I would like to thank the German Association for American Studies, our section for American Studies here in Tübingen, as well as the Tübingen School of Education for organizing this event. And I wish you a very fruitful conference and enjoy, hopefully, the weather and a nice town. And thank you very much for your attention.
Welcome to Tübingen. You may be somewhat surprised to see me here in front of you. I appear in front of you today as an improviser, as a mediator, as a go-between. My name is Uwe Küchler. I'm one of the local organizers, and on behalf of Astrid Franke and Katharina Luther also, I would like to welcome you. In the attempt to be more inclusive, we will make use of different shades and shapes of hybridity in the course of the day, but also of the conference. And we have the backing of our very competent techies from the Zentrum für Medienkompetenz up there in the Carol. It is my modest job tonight to help you transition through the hybrid elements of this conference, mediating basically between here on the ground and the live stream on Zoom on YouTube. Due to a positive test result in the family, Deborah Diekmann, our representative of the Tübingen School of Education, cannot be here today in person. She was so kind to pre-record her welcoming remarks, and I would like to play you this little video clip right now.
Hello, good day everyone, and welcome to the annual meeting of the German Association for American Studies. My name is Deborah Diekmann, and I'm speaking to you today from the Tübingen School of Education. Professor Dr. Thorsten Bohl, Director of TÜSE, and Professor Dr. Frank Lohse, as Deputy Director, would have liked to speak to you today in person, but unfortunately they have to be excused. And also I can only be here digitally today. The Tübingen School of Education is pleased to be involved as a cooperation partner in the annual meeting of the German Association for American Studies and to participate in this outstanding event. The foundation of the Tübingen School of Education as a central interfaculty scientific institution in 2015 was a major milestone for teacher education in Tübingen, as some of you might already know. The formation of a new committee structure, as well as the creation of 18 additional professorships for teacher education, and also the expansion to 7 work areas, including the rapidly growing work area of internationalization, continued to support the guidelines of the university's future concept in research relevance and responsibility. So certainly the Department of Internationalization of the TÜSE is particularly proud of this special cooperation, because only through the involvement of new colleagues and the development of TÜSE, events like this can be realized. So accordingly, the annual meeting of the DGfA is also closely linked to the development of the TÜSE, especially in perspective of future developments of internationalization processes. Through exchange programs and guest lectureships, for example, worldwide networks and contacts can be founded and strengthened, which are a fundamental basis for international cooperations. And especially in today's world and in view of current political developments, every global cooperation needs a normative basis. According to Article 1 of the Basic Law, the German Grundgesetz, the dignity of man is inviolable. Because future challenges can only be overcome together through international cross-cutting programs, especially through strong connections between education and politics, as it is the focus of this event, political education in American studies. In this context, the TUSE and the Faculty of English Didactics and American Studies at the University of Tübingen can already look back on a long and sustainable cooperation. Therefore, it is also very important to the TUSE that this program and its goals continue to be realized and supported. Therefore, we would like to thank all participants and explicitly Uwe Küchler for the international collaboration and the cooperation. Also, we would like to thank Professor Andreotti from the University of British Columbia and her involvement in the conference and her stay as a key speaker at the University of Tübingen.
Thank you all for the kind words of welcome. At this point, it was my original job to call my dear colleague Lilian to the stand. Lilian is Associate Professor of Teaching English as a Foreign Language. Alas, due to another medical incident that just occurred the past weekend, she has to take care of pain management rather than be here, and she can also not be here in hybrid form. So I'm basically taking over Lilian's place and introduce our keynote speaker. And I largely am supported by the preparatory work that Lilian has already made before the incident. Let me interject a few words about the hybrid format of this keynote address. Even though this may be unusual for keynote speeches, Professor Andreotti has agreed to a question and answer period right after her talk. After all, this is very much consistent with her work, with her focus on participation, say, or agency. I'm saying this now so you can prepare a couple of questions, and later on I will talk more about the choreography between the ground and the people far away on Zoom. It is such a pleasure and an honor to welcome Professor Vanessa Andreotti as our first keynote speaker and as the opening act, if you will, for our conference here on political education and American studies. Vanessa Andreotti can be described as a scholar, educator, activist. We were so eager to invite her for this keynote address because she epitomizes the transdisciplinary rationale of our conference and its themes. Her work is driven by a sense of urgency at a historical moment of unprecedented global crises and challenges. Vanessa Andreotti has been professor at the Department of Educational Studies at the University of British Columbia since 2017. She holds a Canada Research Chair with the denomination Race, Inequality, and Global Change. She is currently also interim director of the Peter Wall Institute of Advanced Studies. And furthermore, she is co-founder of a collective by the name of Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures. In this group of researchers, artists, and educators, but also with students and indigenous knowledge keepers, they work together on educational experiments that try to uncover colonial patterns and that help to point out decolonial futures. Andreotti is widely known for her work in the fields of global citizenship education and global justice, as much as for the ethics of internationalization. Her research and her pedagogy explore the intersection between historical forms of violence and unsustainability, and also its systemic, material, and existential dimensions. Vanessa Andreotti's work promotes the self-reflexive engagement with the very premises of scholarship and research, also with education and social activism. In order to reconceptualize ways of learning and teaching, Andreotti argues it is necessary to interrogate our ways of being, our ways of perceiving, and our ways of acting in this world. Not only the staggering amount of articles and books Andreotti has published is noteworthy, When we talk about different epistemologies and accessibility of knowledge, it is quite remarkable to see that Andreotti makes her publications available publicly. There is open access to almost all, if not all, of her articles, but also podcasts, video recordings on her homepage, on academia, or in the Creative Commons. Her latest monograph has the intriguing title, Hospicing Modernity, Facing Humanity's Wrongs and the Implications of Social Activism. It was published in 2021 and is a very activating, indeed, in a very activating educational style. Andreotti draws readers into her book with academic reasoning and argumentation, yet also with storytelling elements and exercises for readers. She examines the violence and unsustainability that are so typical of modernity, yet also typical of the difficulties to untangle and breaking free from modernity's grasp. To get a taste of Andreotti's work, let me quote from a book review by Nigerian philosopher, professor, and writer-activist Bayo Akomolafe. This book is rude, like a shaman's confident cackle, like the punch of an elder whose eyes shimmer with a secret, like a trickster's feverish dance to a drumbeat in a time supposedly past. And right there, my fellow modern citizen, right there in the author's cosmological rudeness lies her deepest medicine. Navigating her rigorous work is an exercise in defamiliarizing modernity as the air we breathe, the site of our persistent illnesses, and the earthly thing that can give way to something else. It is time to gather. We can start here, together. I'm sure that we will come back to some of those issues in the upcoming lecture, and the Tübingen School of Education, represented by Deborah Diekmann, was very pleased that it could generously sponsor our keynote address here. We are very glad that Vanessa Andreotti will join us today from the Canadian West, where it is 8 o'clock in the morning right now. Her keynote address carries the title, Gesturing Beyond the Modern Colonial Grammar of Political Education. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Andreotti.
Thank you so much for this welcome and warm introduction. I'm just going to share my screen here. Let's see if it's the right one. Yes, and here. So I'll start the session today with a land acknowledgement. This is what we are asked to do here in Canada. And it's a request from Indigenous communities. So I'm speaking to you from the unceded ancestral territories of the Stolo Indigenous peoples in what is currently known as Maple Ridge in British Columbia. And by starting with a land acknowledgement, there is a commitment to supporting Indigenous peoples to have their stolen lands returned to them and their livelihoods also restored. The land acknowledgement also represents something very different that happens in Canada in terms of political education, which is the emphasis on Indigenous peoples, because this is a settler colonial state, and also because of the recent history of grappling with the truth of colonization through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and also very recently the revelation of the unmarked graves of children in residential schools. So there's a difference there with the political focus in the US, and things are changing very rapidly in this area here in Canada, because all the complexities and paradoxes of grappling with issues of indigeneity and of multiculturalism are coming to the fore. But today in this talk, I will present the work of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective and some exercises that we refer to as depth education. In the course of this talk, we will visit 3 racialized female elders of political education in the US. These are Gayatri Spivak, which we're going to look at in the beginning, and then we're going to visit Gloria Anzaldúa and Audre towards the end. These elders have inspired and informed the work of my research collective. In this visit to these grandmothers, I will invite you not to canonize them. Canonization is part of the problem. The imposition of an idealized, unachievable standard of humanity on any human being or group of human beings is also a form of violence. I will invite you to visit these grandmothers as ordinary, complex human beings rather than exceptional scholars or artists. I'll invite you to respect their work as something that could be either medicine or poison, depending on the time and context it is received. I invite you also to see the quality of ordinariness as an unexpected gift we bestow upon them and upon ourselves. Here is our first elder, Gayatri Spivak. I have a huge debt to this elder. Not only has Spivak given me the words to a more nuanced analysis of global North and South relations, she also helped articulate the problems with Western benevolence and the paradoxes faced by the diaspora. But most importantly, she made me interested in the colonization of our collective and individual unconscious. Spivak and many of her post-structuralist and post-colonial contemporaries took Lacanian psychoanalysis very seriously, and they focused on the relationship between language and reality. This turns education, which is fundamentally a Cartesian project, upside down, as it emphasizes the affective and relational dimensions of learning. The focus on the relationship between language and reality also moves the analysis from epistemology to ontology, and this also has enormous implications for political education. The kind of psychoanalysis that informs my work today is not Lacanian, but without the post-structuralist, post-colonial, and Lacanian foundations, I would not have been able to do the work in education that I do today. Spivak talks about education with reference to literature, and she's notoriously difficult to read. But two key ideas in her work that are still driving the work of my research collective today are the following. The first is education in the humanities as an uncoercive rearrangement of desires. And this would be done towards an ethical imperative towards the other before will. For me, this reflects a commitment towards the interruption of harmful conditioned desires and towards the activation of a visceral form of responsibility that is neither an intellectual choice or tied to the allocation of will. You will probably see the influence of Spivak ideas in the work that I will share with you today. So I'll start by presenting the work of the collective, invite you to some exercises, and then we will visit the other grandmothers at the end. So starting with the Gtdf Collective. Gtdf is a transdisciplinary collective of researchers, artists, educators, students, and indigenous knowledge keepers. We work at the interface of questions related to historical, systemic, and ongoing violence, and questions related to the unsustainability of our current habits of being. The collective tries to bring together concerns related to racism, colonialism, unsustainability, climate change, biodiversity loss, economic instability, mental health crisis, intensifications of social and ecological violence, and possible climates and social collapse. Because this is super heavy content, we try to build collective capacity, dispositions, and stamina for difficult work, which is self and world unmaking, through artistic and educational experiments where people can practice holding space for painful things without feeling overwhelmed, immobilized, or demanding quick fixes. So the work of the collective is grounded on an understanding that says that these unprecedented global challenges that we're facing are not fundamentally informational problems, but symptoms of a harmful ontometaphysics or habit of being. We are trying to create a political practice of healing and well-being at the end of the world as we know it. Surrendering the terms of our unsustainable existence based on extraction, exploitation, and overconsumption, and creating a form of relationality and politics based on humility and complicity rather than exceptionalism and liberation. We work with the concept of depth education in the creation of these pedagogical containers for critical system and complexity literacies grounded on post-colonial, decolonial, indigenous, and non-Western psychoanalytic practices, including intellectual, affective, and relational unlearning, which involves intellectual, artistic, embodied, and land-based experiments. Our practice is grounded on engagements with indigenous communities, and we are trying to focus on engagements based on trust, reciprocity, consent, and accountability, rather than extraction and appropriation, but where we can enact respect beyond the idealization and romanticization of these communities. Our work is anchored, because it's psychoanalytical work, it's anchored on 4 denials. So the first is the denial of systemic violence and complicity in harm, the fact that our comfort, securities, and enjoyments are subsidized by expropriation and exploitation. They exist at other people's expense, so this is not just a matter of exclusion. The second is the denial of the limits of the planet, the fact that the planet cannot sustain exponential growth and consumption. The third denial is the denial of entanglement, our insistence in seeing ourselves as separate from each other and the land, rather than entangled within a living, wider metabolism that is biointelligent. And the fourth is the denial of the magnitude and complexity of the problem. The tendencies to look for hope in simplistic solutions that make us feel and look good, and to turn away from difficult work, often using future forecasting and projective hope as an escape mechanism from the difficulties of the present. So the other thing that is probably different about the collective is that we work in educational environments, and we have an analysis of these educational environments that place them at a different time from the time that the grandmothers, for example, were enacting their politics. So we look at our complex socio-educational context as characterized by 6 different new things. The first one is a cacophony of perspectives, or heteroglossia, misinformation overload, and the impossibility of stable authorities or imposed consensus. The second is an oversaturation of unprocessed emotions, a lack of resilience and collective capacity to process complex emotions within and around us. The third one is VUCA, which stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And the increase in volatility, uncertainty, social complexity, and ambiguity leads to social fragmentation and polarized perspectives on the common good. The fourth is meta-consumption, the idea that consumption in our current society is a mode of relating to the world, where there are incentives and rewards for hedonistic, narcissistic, and hyper-individualistic behaviors that leads to a meta-entitlement to create reality. The next one is a context of self-infantilization, a proliferation of fragilities and entitlements, a demand for coddling, which is described by some of our indigenous partners as a failure of the Western culture to produce grown-ups, which then is related to this focus on feeling and looking good and seeing hope as or in projection rather than relational weaving. So this idea of putting hope in the future, imagining an idea of the future as a harmonious future that actually serves as an escape of dealing with the difficulties of the present, which in our collective we call, and pardon my word, but it's the shit, the collective and individual, historical and systemic shit that we need to learn to compost together so that it becomes new soil for new forms of politics and relationships to sprout from. And the next one is intergenerational resentment. So in our work with youth collectives, we found that because we have reached the limits of the planet and the promises of endless prosperity are broken, we have youth, several youth, describing their experience of this moment to us as watching a train wreck in slow motion. And often previous generations are blamed for younger generations feeling shortchanged. So we take all of this into account as we're creating these pedagogical containers where we invite people to expand their capacity to sit with the beautiful, the ugly, the broken, and the messed up within and around us, and expand their capacity to sit with difficult things without feeling overwhelmed, immobilized, or demanding quick fixes, or to be rescued from the discomfort. So we have this distinction between positive or mastery education and depth education. So mastery or positive education is what we see in formal schooling, in Western formal schooling, where you have, metaphorically, you can relate it to filling up a cup with tea, measuring the cup, or with this idea of conquering, mastering something, conquering a peak. We contrast that with depth education, which instead of filling in a cup, we see it much more as peeling the layers of an onion and crying in the process in order to develop the hyper self-reflexivity that is needed for us to learn from the mistakes of the past in order to make only different mistakes in the future. We also compare it to, instead of conquering a peak, to taking a deep dive in a freezing ocean and discovering that we are mostly water. We are the water that we are diving in, but we're also the toxins that we have placed in that water. Depth education questions are slightly different from the usual education questions that we have in formal education. Here, there are 3 of them. So the first one is, how do we prepare ourselves to tackle the wicked problems of our time, including unprecedented complex dilemmas and also disasters of our own making that we will have to face together? How can we learn to do the kindest and most responsible thing to each other and to the land at all times, especially in times of crisis and polarization? How can we learn to choose sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability in a culture of late modernity that often promotes and rewards the opposite? And here are some of the dispositions that depth education is trying to encourage. So the first one is diffractive assessment. So this is a form of analysis that layers the self and that layers reality in order to articulate complexities and paradoxes. Then there's diachronic and analectic reasoning that invites people to connect dots in the bigger picture across time and non-dialectically. Then there's psychoaffective stamina, which is about holding space for difficulties and discomfort without being overwhelmed, immobilized, or demanding quick fixes. Then we have ontosympathetic resonance, which is about tuning into the pain of others in oneself and interrupting harmful desires and perceived entitlements. Then we have heteroglossic dexterity, which is about navigating the ambivalence of language and the cacophony of perspectives in a generative way. And we have a compass called SMDR that needs to be recalibrated, which is about moving towards the colonial forms of sobriety, maturity, discernment, and responsibility as we face shadows, compost shit, and get through storms together. Now, from now on, I'm going to be inviting you to experiment some of the intellectual experiments we have been using with several groups for the last 7 years. And the first one, I think one of the most important of this of these experiments and these tools is the bus. So in terms of layering ourselves and layering reality, we offer this analogy or figuration actually of the bus. We invite people to imagine that there's a bus within them. If you imagine the bus, it doesn't matter. Just imagine any metaphor that alludes to a plurality of voices. So there's always a plurality of voices and affects within us that generally doesn't get recognized as we try to impose coherence, both in our conscious and unconscious responses. So we ask people to imagine the bus and imagine the bus with a driver and several passengers, passengers at the front of the bus, in the middle of the bus, at the back of the bus. And we invite people to develop a psychoanalytic distance as they observe their buses. And ask, what is each passenger saying, thinking, feeling? How old are they? Are they speaking from fear, from trauma? Do they sound like somebody you know? Do they want things to be black and white? Do they trust the driver? So this exercise is about inviting people to sit with their own complexity and to layer themselves, layer their own experience. So the bus has also different decks. In one of the decks, you're just your individual self. In another deck, you have all your ancestors, both those who have come before, those who are yet to come. In another layer, you have the whole of humanity inside your bus. Another layer, there's more than humanity. And in another layer, there's us, but beyond space, time, and form. So this methodology, the bus has become a methodology for holding space with people and doing debriefings as we engage with difficult issues. And it has been incredibly useful, because if we don't have the tools to engage with our own layers of complexity, we won't have any tools to engage with the complexity around us. And everything that we try to repress as we spend a lot of energy trying to impose coherence on our own internal experience ends up coming back as projections towards other people and the decision making itself. So the bus has become a very important feature of the pedagogy, of depth pedagogy and depth education. So I will invite you, as you engage with the other experiments, to keep your bus in view, to check your bus, observe your bus, establish that psychoanalytic distance, and see how different passengers within you are responding to the exercises. So the next exercise that I'm going to illustrate is an exercise called the House Modernity Built. So this is a story that I'm going to tell you in about 5 minutes that talks about it tries to synthesize some of the literature, decolonial, post-colonial, and indigenous literature, offering a critique of modernity, but it was also workshopped with indigenous communities on the ground and changed in the process. So the story goes like this. There's a planet. It's in 4 parts, in 4 frames. But the first frame, there's a planet, and there's a house built on top of this planet. And this house, as it expands, is exceeding the limits of the planet. This is the house that modernity built. This house has a foundation of separability, which is the separation between us and the land and each other and the other animals and other species. And this separability creates a sense of intrinsic worthlessness of life itself. So life is only valued when it produces value within the house. So in order for us to feel worthy of being alive, we need to produce value within the economies of the house. And these economies are many, and they change depending on the context. There are 2 carrying walls in the house. One is the nation state, the other one is universal reason. The carrying wall of the nation state has a reminder that the nation state, although we do place in the state the responsibility for the protection of people, the nation state was historically created to protect property and property owners. And we as we see from critical race theory and critical scholarship and legal studies, there's only dispensation of rights, of labor rights, human rights, civil rights, when there's interest convergence between the dispensation of rights and the rights of capital, the protection of the rights of capital. The carrying wall of universal reason is one that establishes a single story of progress, development, civilization, and human evolution. And the single story is also aimed to obliterate other possibilities in what Boaventura de Souza Santo calls epistemicides. And in the roof of the house, we have global capital, which is shareholder capitalism, shareholder algorithmic financial capitalism, which is different from the roof of socialism, communism, and even industrial capitalism. And we say that this roof of financial shareholder speculative algorithmic capitalism is compromised, is fundamentally and structurally damaged. So that's the first frame. The second frame talks about the hidden costs of the house of modernity. So inside the house, we have unsustainable growth and overconsumption, and then two arrows, one arrow of expropriation from the planet into the house, and another arrow of waste disposal. And in the planet, we see destitution, dispossession, and genocide. So this frame talks about how the house has been created, it's subsidized, and is maintained by violence. The third frame, the floors of the house, plays with the idea of the global north and south. So in the penthouse of the house, we have the north of the north, people with historical discretionary income. Then we have in the middle of the house, the stairs of social mobility representing the north of the south, those who are invested in getting to the north of the north and having unending discretionary income. Then we have the basement of the house, which is the south of the north, people who want the protections of the house, but who are not necessarily invested in social mobility, but they're more invested in community. But these are the ones who provide the services for the north of the south and the north of the north. And in the south of the south, in the planet, we have the people who are trying to fight for a different form of existence, including partners that we have in Brazil, the Honikui people, for example, who are putting their lives on the line to protect their way of life and protect the Amazon from the destruction that, especially right now, President Bolsonaro is inflicting upon them. So this frame talks about how the house offers a false promise of universal middle class for all, and underscores the fact that if everybody was in the place of the north of the south, and the house was expanded with social mobility, we would need many more planets to be able to sustain the levels of production and consumption that would be necessary. So the last frame talks about the weight of climate change or climate catastrophe, the economic instability, cancellation of rights, precarity, populism, that is causing not just the structural damage of the roof, but the structural damage of the house itself. So you see the cracks representing social, economic, political, ecological, and mental health crisis. And in the planet, the increase in violent conflict and mass and forced migration. So this frame asks us, do we fix the house, do we expand the house, do we build another house, do we learn to live without a house, do we find more planets? And these are the questions we're interested in. And as we put these questions in front of people, we see that there are generally three forms of engagement that we find. And the first one is the engagement we call soft reform of the house of modernity, where you see people wanting more modernity, the same forward, same leadership, but just small changes. So it's the same usual questions and the same answers. The second one we call radical reform of the house of modernity, where there's more modernity, but there's different leadership and larger changes. So it's the same questions, but different answers. And then there's the beyond reform orientation, where there's an acknowledgement that more modernity is not an option given the violence required for it to expand and the limits of the planet. And here we find different questions and different answers. And we're interested in all of them and trying to map how people engage in these things, both in terms of their cognitive frames, their affective frames, and their relational frames. And in terms of cognitive frames, one of the things we have also come up with in terms of how the house of modernity also conditions our reasoning, our ways of reasoning. We came up with this idea of this entity called boxhead. So boxhead represents the grammar of reasoning within the house of modernity. And in the frame, you will see the filters of reasoning that are used for you to be intelligible within the house. So you would need to use dialectical, utility maximizing, logocentric, evolutionary, Cartesian, teleological, allochronic, and anthropocentric filters in your language and experience of reality in order to be intelligible. And these words generally have the effect of what's within the box, which is I think, therefore I am, I say, therefore it is, I own, therefore I rule, I lead, therefore you follow, I arbitrate, therefore you comply, I rock, therefore you suck. And there are two ways of looking at this box. One way is to say there is a box and there is an outside of the box, and it's a useful way to look at it. But there's another way, which is to see the box not necessarily as a box, but as a drawing of a box. And in the drawing of a box, there's a line that draws the box. And so we call this line, and we focus on this line in order to understand how the erotic, the aesthetic, the intuitive, the ludic, the divine, the hilarious, and the other than human can interrupt the box and also be co-opted by the box itself. So here we have conversations about how the arts can both interrupt the box or be co-opted by the box in the same kind of value production. We also look at the desires of Boxhead, and that's what Spivak comes in the invitation to the interruption and rearrangement of desires. So we talk about desires, entitlements, and archetypes within the house modernity built, where we have the archetype of justice arbitration, moral authority representing agency, the archetypes of unreserved admiration and duty affirmation representing benevolence, and the archetype of unrestricted autonomy representing exceptionalism. So within each of these archetypes, we have sub-archetypes like the judge, the righteous, the expert. But today I'm going to focus on the unrestricted autonomy archetype at the bottom, which is the innocent, the virtuous, and the deserving. And here in our collective, we have an analysis of how the way we experience this methodology is that when people open up to the possibility of entanglement, people do want to connect with the whales, the flowers, the moon, and the sun, but they do not want to connect and feel entangled with the collective and individual shit to be composted. So there's a sanitization of our complicity in harm and unsustainability. And it's precisely this sanitization that needs to be addressed before we can start to weave a different future. We also looked at modernity in terms of desires, entitlements, and archetypes through this lens or cartography of the epic A, which would stand for epic arrogance. In each of these letters then encompasses an assemblage of characteristics that we see in politics, in education, in learning, in social innovation, for example. So for example, E would be exceptionalism, exaltedness, expansion of entitlements, externalization of culpability, escape from responsibility, which is most visible in political discourses that fall within that frame. P stands for progress, prosperity, purity, heroic protagonism, and projective hope, which is most visible in orientations to development, social innovation, and sustainability. I stands for idealization, innocence, immunity, indifference, and indulgence, which is most visible in cross-cultural engagements and artistic practices. C is about certainty, control, compulsive consumption, competitiveness, comfort, convenience, and complacency, which is most visible in approaches to learning and the design of education. And A is about epistemic and moral authority, unrestricted and unaccountable autonomy, justice and common sense arbitration, guilt absolution, the avant-garde, and it's most visible in intellectual engagements and activism. And that is the assemblage of arrogance. So we also talk about the adjacent possible, what's viable but unimaginable for us within the constraints of the house of modernity. And here we came up with a framework that was then worked through with indigenous communities in Brazil and became this analogy to mushrooms and mycelium. So mycelium is the substrata that is under it's generally in the soil where the mushrooms come from. So the mushrooms are fruit of healthy mycelium. So in the mycelium but we have cognitive, affective, and relational justice. And the mushrooms represent ecological and economic justice. So the idea here is that without healthy mycelium, there's no mushroom. So ecological and economic justice depend on cognitive, affective, and relational justice. But an important thing here to note was that when we still use this, the cartography with justice, but in the communities in the South, as we were workshopping this, that was the first thing that was challenged. So in the South, we were asked to use, instead of justice, which is a Western modern colonial concept that is teleological, instead use the frame of healing and well-being. So we're talking about ecological and economic healing and well-being being dependent on cognitive, affective, and relational healing and well-being. So back to visiting the grandmothers, we have here Anzaldúa and Audre Lorde. Anzaldúa saying, awareness of our situation must come before inner changes, which in turn come before changes in society. Nothing happens in the real world unless it first happens in the images in our heads. And Audre Lorde saying, the white fathers told us, I think, therefore I am. And the black mothers in each of us, the poet whispers in our dreams, I feel, therefore I can be free. But what I would like to emphasize here is that depending on how you look at these two quotes, if you look at it only through an epistemic layer or an ontological layer, we read different things in what these grandmothers are saying. So for example, what happens in the images in our heads may mean that we have to imagine the future before we can get there, through an epistemic lens, still based on modernity, or it can mean something completely different if we bring a non-Western psychoanalytic lens to bear. It means that in that sense, I think my understanding is that it requires us to sit with the limits of our imagination, especially with how our imagination has also been conditioned and constrained by modernity, and start to open up to what is unimaginable but viable in terms of relationality and politics. The same way with Audre Lorde, I feel, therefore I can be free, begs other kinds of questions from an epistemic layer, still within the house of modernity. This freedom has specific connotations. When we look at it through a non-Western psychoanalytic lens, freedom means something else. So when you ask about freedom, you have to be asking free from what? It could be that this freedom is the freedom from these conditionings of modernity as well. So in order to wrap up this presentation, I will leave you with a question, which is part of the inquiry of the Gesturing Towards the Colonial Futures Collective, which is what we are trying to wrestle with. And the question is, what kind of political education could, number one, deactivate harmful conditioned modern colonial desires, supporting the decolonization of our unconscious? Two, activate capacities exiled by the house of modernity, including the capacity to be viscerally responsible towards the whole shebang, towards everything. Three, what kind of political education could enable us to navigate volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and to tap the adjacent possible, what is viable but unimaginable within our current imaginary constraints? And four, what kind of political education could create the conditions for a political practice of healing and well-being, not driven by the 5 E's of exceptionalism, exaltedness, externalization of culpability, the expansion of colonial entitlements, or the elevation and empowerment of the ego? So thank you. Most of these ideas are in the Hospicing Modernity book, but although the book has a single author, I cannot emphasize enough how this has been a collective inquiry, and that without having people around me with affinity to this inquiry and in agreement on the integrity and depth of the inquiry as well, that I wouldn't be able to be doing any of this. So the importance of the Gtdf Collective cannot be underemphasized, and I'm very grateful for having them in my life, but also very grateful for your time and listening to what we've been doing so far. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very much, Vanessa Andreotti, for such a wonderful and inspiring, thought-provoking talk. And luckily, now we have time for questions and answers, a couple of minutes. And as I said before, I would like to introduce you to the choreography of this questioning and answering. We have a couple of people online that follow us. Please send your question in the chat to Chair Audimax, that's me. I will see the questions, I will read them out. And we have, of course, 2 microphones. Astrid and Katharina will walk around if you indicate clearly that you want to ask a question, and then I will try to alternate between the 2 pools of questions. I'm talking a little so you can make up your minds, but you can send questions or ask, indicate, strecken, wie man hier sagt, to show that you would like to ask something.
Thank you for your talk. I was really interested in your concept of decolonial sobriety. We all know about the problems with addiction in colonized people, but also some of the young white people we're teaching are having problems with sobriety. And do you see this as a sort of their intuitive awareness of how screwed everything is? Or what connections, can you say more about decolonial sobriety, I guess?
Thank you. This is a great question. So first, I'll just say that when we talk about addictions, we have to be very careful, because addiction language has been used also to stigmatize people with chemical dependencies. And so we are very careful when we talk about this, but it came from a discussion with people in those circumstances. We have a member of our collective who is in recovery and who said that as we started to discuss this, addiction to heroin is very similar to addiction to consumption, to addiction to carbon. So when we see addiction and carefully as a metaphor for how we have seen now consumption as a mode of relating to the world. And here we're not just talking about consumption of stuff, of goods, but also consumption of relationships, consumption of experiences, consumption of knowledge, consumption of critique. We found that relating it to the concept of addiction was interesting, because addiction is a compulsion that is often irrational of things that, and you cannot stop, right? So, and it's also neurobiologically bound. So in the book also, we talk about the setup of modernity being a neurobiological setup. So, for example, our addictions, in the book, we talk about 4 neurochemicals that are sourced in specific ways within modernity. And these are dopamine, oxytocin, endorphins, and adrenaline. And in the book, there is a discussion of how they can, these neurochemicals, these neurochemicals represent our sense of well-being within modernity. So, for example, when we have likes on Facebook, you're getting dopamine hits. And this is changing our neurobiological setup. When you engage in cute cat videos, also on Instagram, you are receiving oxytocin hits. But if we look at, and these things are natural, like the dopamine, oxytocin, endorphins, and adrenaline are things that we need to survive. The problem is how it's sourced and mobilized within modernities to keep us in the hamster wheel of the production of value within its economies, and how it is tied to our sense of worthlessness if we don't reproduce these things. So if we see modernity as a drug pusher, it really helps to see how we get caught neurobiologically in a very restricted cocktail that gives us a false sense of well-being, or gives us some temporary well-being that then requires us to go back for more. And in the book, when we discussed that, the point of the discussion was to say that there are other forms of well-being that have been exiled by the house. And when we work with Indigenous people in the South, especially Indigenous people who have kept practices of survival and survivance that require, for example, a different relationship with pain, a different relationship with living and dying well, a different relationship with struggle, you can see that they can find joy in a very different neurobiological setup. And this is what we say that has been exiled from the house. And we're interested in how that neurobiological setup, especially for Indigenous communities that have the training necessary to engage with cultures of vision through entheogenic practices, for example. And here I'm talking about ayahuasca, mescaline, or mushrooms. We're very interested in the discipline required, in the education they have for the training for engaging with these practices. And what we see in that training in terms of sobriety is that everything is about activating visceral responsibility. So it's nothing about let's just do it as it's done in the West for personal healing or personal power. It is all about how you put yourself in service of the protection of lands and the protection of the future or the planet, right? So this is actually what inspired us also to look at our current state as a state of addiction. I hope this answered the question.
Thank you very much for your talk. I am interested in the terminology, or in some of the terminology that you use, and in particular in the terms grandmothers and house, because the idea of a grandmother, of course, is something that what immediately struck me was, of course, we all know the phrase, he's the father of American poetry and so on. And in some way, it seems that this reproduces that kind of terminology, which of course is a more Western form of terminology. And I'm wondering, grandmothers, of course, implies a female genealogy, and who are the mothers then? So there is a sequence of grandmother, mother, daughters, and so on. So I'm wondering about that implication. And also, you mentioned Spivak, Lord, and Anzaldúa, and I was struck by the fact that you did not include any indigenous grandmother. And I'm wondering whether you could perhaps comment on that. And finally, the term house, well, just the question of a house, again, is not necessarily an indigenous concept as far as I know. So maybe, again, you could comment on why you use that particular image of describing the project that you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's very good. Yeah, it's very good questions. So where do we start? The part of the frame of modernity is this idea of universalization, right? So if you approach indigenous communities with the idea of bringing their knowledge into the universalization within the house of modernity, for example, you're going to be doing that in an extractive way. And unfortunately, that's in a way inevitable in the ways that we're approaching indigenous knowledges today. And I'm sure that in our collective, although we try not to do that, in the end, some of it gets reproduced. So we are complicit in doing a bit of that. But one of the things we're trying to do too is to show that a lot of the people that we work with in the South, they do not want to be represented in our work as exceptional. And that's why I put the invitation in the beginning, not to see these grandmothers as exceptional, but as complex, ordinary beings, and to use their work and to also see their work both as potential medicine and potential poison, depending on the context and the time and how they are mobilized. So they can be also weaponized, right? So I think the approach here is to say, instead of trying to replace modernity with something else that is outside of it, that could be where we should all get to, we're not taking that approach. We're saying we have to understand where we stand, and what we can learn from these indigenous peoples are practices that they have maintained in terms of responsibility without romanticizing and idealizing them. They are also complex communities with complex, contradictory, and paradoxical people. But these practices of education related to responsibility cannot be just plucked from one place and put here. We have to do the work of recreating the practices of responsibility within the cultures that we are situated. And I'm situated within the Western culture, within the house. So we are not looking for authentic metaphors that would represent something else. We are looking for metaphors that will trouble our desire for this something else, that will help us to stay with the difficulties of the fact that the house is very modern, and that's very much the university. That's very much the modern subjectivity. That's where I am. That's where you are. That's us. And unless we can sit with the difficulty of that, there's no way we can just replace it by something that represents a new universal or a new horizon that we should all get to. And I think that's what these communities were asking us to do. However, you picked up upon the grandmother thing, which is interesting. So this is, I think, where we are doing what we say we're not in that sense, because the concept of eldership is what is, for me, embedded in the grandmother concept and ancestral responsibility there. So part of our work with these indigenous communities, actually it was work that was directed by Kesha Hennique, who is one of our indigenous scholars here in Canada, was to ask indigenous peoples, both here in the North and South, what education was for. And we never heard from anybody that education was for finding a job. We had the responses were more or less about education being about preparing the baby from the day the baby is born to become good elders and good ancestors for all relations. So our use of grandmothers here is a way of honoring the eldership of those women. And in honoring that eldership, it's not a canonizing way where we're coming from, also from that other sensibility. It is a way of saying that elders are elders because of the mistakes they have made. And the ability to process these mistakes into medicine that can be passed to new generations, to younger generations. So the same way, this happens in the same way when we talk about hospicing modernity and assisting with prenatal care of something that is being gestated without suffocating it with projections. We are trying to interrupt what you identified as this lineage of human lineage, right? And we are saying, for example, that what is being born might not be born from the human imagination. It could be born out of us actually decentering ourselves and letting the land imagine through us what needs to happen next, because as has been said before, we have screwed it up. So it's all entangled in the sensibility that we are not trying to present them as exceptional. We are trying to present them as ordinary and trying to see this ordinariness as a gift and issue a call for eldership, where they are the current elders, we will be the next elders, and the children coming after us are going to be the next elders. And this is what it is about, learning to process the mistakes we have been recurrently making, so that the generations to come will only make different mistakes in the future, not the ones that we have made. So it's a different understanding of genealogy, I think. But we start back to the house, we start from where we're stuck, not with a replacement with something that we want to see.
Thank you. I have a question from the internet, and I will just read it out. I don't have a name that goes with it, so I'll just read it to you. Thank you for this hugely informative talk. I'm still sitting with the notion of a world falling apart or breaking down as a process of decomposition, and as such, as part of the semantic field of waste and shit that you evoked. Could you elaborate on the collective's discussion of shit, rot, etc., as related to processes of decomposition that in some ways are the key to soil fertility and regrowth, as well as to processes of working through staying with the shit, so to speak, and perhaps also forms of well-being that you mentioned as exiled from the house of modernity?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. We do have an expert in shit in the collective. It's Dr. Will Valley from the department, the Faculty of Land and Food Systems here at UBC, and he would absolutely love your formulation of the question, and he would give you all the scientific details of how this metaphor can be also decomposed into carbon and matter and all of that. Unfortunately, this is not my area. I'm always in awe when I hear him speak about that too. But I think what we did together with Will, and I'll talk about that, was a course called Facing Human Wrongs. And the course is actually available online, Creative Commons as well, for everybody to have a look at, which was grounded on the 4 denials. And we use the metaphor of the shit to, and he does it very well. He invites people to be joyful as they compost shit, because this is a fundamental process that is required for the creation of new soil. And in that sense, it was not him who gave me the idea. There's a chapter on the book called There's No Away, where I also reflect on my own engagement with the processes of composting in Peru. And the idea of the wet toilet, like the toilet that we press the flush and the shit goes away, right? So that is one of the things within modernity that makes us understand that we don't have to deal with it. It goes away. The problem is that there's no way, that it goes somewhere. We just don't know where it is. And in one of my visits to Peru, where an NGO was trying to impose toilets in a community and the women were resisting it, they were imposing not the dry toilets, they were imposing the flush toilets. One of the women told me, I asked, so why don't you want it? And she said, it's because I will not be able to read. And for her, literacy, this reading, I'm assuming, because we got interrupted in that conversation by people from the NGO, it was the whole process of what happens with the soil and the shit. So this sanitization of the world through the wet toilet is part of the problem. And in the Facing Human Wrongs course, where people are invited to sit with the shit, which is akin to staying with the trouble, as Donna Haraway talks about too, what we try to do is just strengthen their capacity to stay with difficult and painful things without feeling overwhelmed, immobilized, demanding quick fixes, or to be rescued from the discomfort. If we can't do that, we will be in a merry-go-round where we are going to always be looking for simplistic solutions We're always going to be engaging with others in a transactional way, and often with the marginalized communities in a paternalistic way, and where our ideals of sustainability, change, justice are always going to be ethnocentric. So unless we can really sit with that which challenges our self-images, our idealizations of the world, and of delusions about ends and means, it's going to be always a merry-go-round. And the more people are invested in the House of Modernity and in the entitlements that come with that, the more difficult it will be for them to face the end of the world as we know it. They will, the more invested, the more traumatic it's going to be. So this whole process of composting also invites a disinvestment in modernity coloniality, understanding that things are going to change, it's inevitable, and you can cooperate with this inevitability or allow this inevitability to bulldoze over you. So yeah, I would, if you're interested in shit composting, I would invite you to have a look at the course. I will put the website on the chat, and maybe I'll see if I can put it here on the screen as well. I will need a second to do that, just a minute.
Thank you. Are there more questions on the floor?
Thank you very much for your presentation. Decolonization of the unconscious is quite a project, and I wonder what gives you the faith that your project can succeed. And I wonder about methods. You mentioned the bus as a method, but I didn't see any method in there. Maybe you can say a little bit more how you work. And the second issue is that I feel the projection of indigeneity that your work implies is very much part of the House of Modernity. It's exactly this kind of othering that modernity entails. And so I wonder whether there is not a stark contradiction in what you're arguing.
Thank you again for the questions. Contradictions and paradoxes is something that we will find everywhere, and it's the search and the desire for that coherence that is also part of the desires of modernity, right? So we're not trying to leave ourselves outside of what we critique. So the self-implication in the critique, and to say, for example, that for us to be intelligible within academia, we still have to use boxhead. We still have to appeal to the grammar of intelligibility. So this kinds of discussions about like the purity of engagements and of definitions is not something that once you're working in this other sensibility, it's not something that becomes a problem. Right? So failure, mistakes, paradoxes, contradictions, all these different layers where we're both complicit in the reproduction of the House of Modernity, and at the same time that we are trying to contest and work in the cracks of it and secure the cracks is all part of the same shebang and the different layers that we have to hold. So the methodology for it is, if you're looking at psychoanalysis, both Western and non-Western, is to take a psychoanalytic distance from the Cartesian self-transparent coherence-seeking self, and to see ourselves as unreliable narrators of our own experience, which stands in stark contrast with most of political education in the US, which is about probably voice, empowerment, and even the non-othering or non-othering that you're talking about, right? So in dialectics too, right? So the idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and I know that I'm talking to people in Hegel's home, probably, where he was trained. So in decolonial studies, we have this concept of analectics, which is a challenge to dialectics. Analectics means taking a step back and understand in a different, changing your relationship to this attachment to progress that you see in the dialectical move. So analectics is more about understanding the folding and unfolding of the possibilities that were placed in front of you and what has been erased in that process. So the possibilities of representation that we have within modernity are extremely limited because the representational semiotics of it is heavily conditioned by teleology, dialectics, anthropocentric reasoning, utility maximizing, and all of that, and all the desires that come with that, right? So analytic is a very difficult thing to teach people how to do. And I think in the course that now is here, that's what we're trying to do in terms of developing diffractive, polysemic, ontosympathetic, diachronic reasoning, and that is often unintelligible to the kind of traditional methodologies that would depend on boxhead, for example, right? So in our collective, the success is also measured in different ways. So we feel that we work in the crack. We are not trying to scale this up, but what we find today is that as shit is hitting the fan, basically in different contexts, and understanding that when like we in the global north are facing very difficult issues, like here in British Columbia, the heat domes, the floods, happening, especially in British Columbia, as people are starting to face this, it is very important for them to remember that they haven't faced this yet because their privilege here depended on this happening to other people in the South, right? So this is, and as people are facing this more and more, there's more interest in something that helps you hold all these complexities and embrace. And so it helps you step back from yourself, from your context, helps you step back temporarily and understand things in more of a big picture way. So I think the invitation then that we offer to people, and we don't say this is for everybody, if people are super invested in keeping the system the same, this kind of pedagogy could actually be damaging because you can't bring people to the deep end and say, okay, like let's deconstruct all your idealizations of reality and of yourself to be able to sit with the good, the bad, the beautiful, the ugly, the broken, and the fucked up. And some people can't recover from that, right? So what we try to do is work with those who come to us. We are not going out and saying like, this is what everybody should be doing. We are saying this is one of the safety nets that will be necessary as things start to escalate. This depth education and the dispositions that are required, the diffractive, diachronic, ontosympathetic, will be extremely important for some groups to be able to sit with their complicity in harm, to be able to sit with the impossibility of what was promised to them. And instead of seeing these promises as broken, they will be able to realize that these promises are unrealistic. So yeah, I think that partly, my response is that we're probably operating from different desires for, and I understand academia has specific parameters of what counts as methodology, what counts as success. We are working in a crack of academia. We have managed to secure the crack through funding projects and citations and publications and all of that. But the project, the horizon that we're seeking is a horizon where we can collectively face the end of the world as we know it without killing each other or further destroying the planet, while we together co-create a different form of existence, not told by the indigenous people, but remembering the practices that they have maintained despite the onslaught of colonialism. So we say in Brazil that in a situation of a flood, it's only when the water reaches your bum that it's possible even for you to swim. So we are, in our own way, we are going to talk to the swimmers, not to even learn how to swim, because how we are going to have to swim here is different from the ways that they're going to swim there, that they have been used to swim there. But we go there to remember that it is possible to swim. They have survived, and we're learning and without romanticizing them, because they are also struggling and have their own contradictions, but learning that about that possibility, that we have been constrained, we are addicted, and once we reach rock bottom, it might be possible for us to learn something different, or at least learn to die well without furthering the problem.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for sharing your work, for giving us inspiration for our upcoming conversations, and thank you very much for being here. Thank you, audience, for your questions. I would like to close this event right now, but not until I remind you that we will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp for our next keynote speech, keynote address, and then we will continue our conversation. And now, at the end of this opening address, I would like to invite you on behalf of the Universität Tübingen and the Tübingen School of Education for a little reception right outside this lecture hall. Thank you very much.